The late afternoon sun painted Hope's Point, Colorado in golden hues, as Frances Kincaid stood alone on the wooden platform of the train station, her trunk at her feet and anxiety building in her chest with every passing minute. She checked her pocket watch for the 20th time, squinting at the delicate hands that confirmed her worst fear: her groom was now 3 hours late, and the final train of the day had come and gone without him. Frances tugged nervously at her simple cream traveling dress, chosen specifically for her first meeting with Thomas Woodward, the man she'd agreed to marry after 6 months of correspondence. At 24, she had left behind her life as a schoolteacher in Boston, traveling west with promises of marriage and a new beginning. Now she stood abandoned, watching as the station attendant cast sympathetic glances in her direction while he prepared to close for the evening. "Miss." The station attendant approached cautiously. "I'm afraid I need to lock up now. Is there someone in town expecting you? Somewhere you can stay?" Frances swallowed hard against the knot in her throat. "No, sir. My fiancé was supposed to meet me." "Perhaps there's been some delay or misunderstanding." The station attendant's face softened with pity. "The hotel down on Main Street might have a room, though with the cattle buyers in town, I wouldn't count on it." Frances nodded stiffly, fighting back tears. Her carefully saved funds wouldn't last more than a few days. What then? Return east in shame? The mere thought made her stomach twist. As the attendant retreated to his office, Frances heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Hope flared briefly. Perhaps Thomas had been delayed and was finally arriving. She straightened her posture and attempted to smooth the wrinkles from her travel-worn dress. The rider came into view, not Thomas, but a stranger. Tall and broad-shouldered atop a chestnut gelding, he wore the dust of the trail on his denim and leather. His face was partially shadowed by a worn brown hat, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw, darkened by stubble. The man reined his horse to a stop, his keen eyes taking in the scene: the closed station, her trunk, and her obvious distress. He tipped his hat back, revealing striking blue eyes that assessed her with unexpected gentleness. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and rough-edged, "station's closing." "You waiting on someone?" Frances hesitated, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "My fiancé was to meet me. It seems there's been some mistake." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to the hitching post. As he approached, she noted the easy confidence in his stride and the weathered look of a man who spent his life under open skies. "Jack Vance," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "Folks call me Jack." "Frances Kincaid," she replied, clinging to proper manners like a lifeline. His eyes took in her trunk and the fading light. "Getting late. Town's full up with the cattle sale. You got arrangements?" Frances shook her head, mortification washing over her. "I'm afraid not. I expected to be welcomed." Something hardened in Jack's expression. "This fiancé have a name?" "Thomas Woodward." Jack's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Woodward's ranch is 15 miles south, too far to reach tonight." He paused, seeming to consider his options. "My sister runs a boarding house just off Main, proper place. She'll likely have room." Frances hesitated. Accepting help from a stranger went against everything she'd been taught, yet her options were desperately limited. "I'd be much obliged," she finally said. Jack nodded once, then hefted her trunk onto his shoulder with surprising ease. "Can you ride?" "My horse can carry double for the short distance." Minutes later, Frances found herself perched behind Jack on his horse, one hand clutching her small handbag while the other gripped the back of his saddle. Her trunk was secured behind them. She maintained a proper distance from his back, though the horse's movement occasionally forced her to sway closer. As they rode down Main Street, Francis took in the frontier town a collection of wooden buildings, some quite substantial, lining both sides of a wide, dusty street. Men in various states of trail-worn attire moved between the saloon and other establishments. Some paused to watch their progress, their gazes making Francis acutely aware of her vulnerable situation. "Cattle sale brings them from all over," Jack explained over his shoulder. "Town's usually quieter." He guided his horse to a two-story clapboard house set back from the main street. A small sign proclaimed it Vance Boarding House. The building was modest but well-maintained, with curtained windows and a swept porch. Before they reached the hitching post, the front door opened, and a woman emerged tall and straight-backed, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled into a practical bun. "Jack, didn't expect you back until—" Her words halted as she noticed Francis. Her expression shifted quickly from surprise to measured interest. Jack dismounted and helped Francis down, his hands steady and impersonal at her waist. "Sarah, this is Miss Frances Kincaid. She needs lodging." His voice dropped slightly. Woodward didn't show. Understanding passed between the siblings and Sarah's face softened. "Of course. Come in, Miss Kincaid. You must be exhausted." Jack retrieved the trunk and followed them inside, setting it down in a simply furnished but clean parlor. "I'll settle your horse," Sarah told her brother, "while you explain things to Miss Kincaid." After Sarah departed, Jack removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair in need of a trim. Standing in the warm lamplight of the parlor, Francis could better see his features strong and weathered, with those striking blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Thomas Woodward," Jack began without preamble, "lost his ranch 3 months ago. Gambling debts." Francis felt the blood drain from her face. "I received a letter from him just weeks ago, confirming my arrival date. He's likely in Denver by now, or deeper in debt elsewhere." Jack's direct gaze held something like regret. "I'm sorry to be the one telling you this, madam." Francis sank onto a nearby chair, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. "I've come all this way. I've sold everything." Jack shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the shimmer of tears in her eyes. "Sarah will give you fair rates for lodging while you sort things out." Francis nodded numbly, trying to maintain her composure. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Vance." Jack replaced his hat. "I'm here now, that's what matters. Rest tonight. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure the rest." With that simple declaration, he nodded once more and departed, leaving Francis alone with her shattered plans and an uncertain future in a town where she knew no one, except a straight-talking cowboy and his sister. Sarah returned moments later, bringing with her the scent of something savory from the kitchen. "I've got a room ready upstairs and stew on the stove. You look like you could use both." Francis attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your brother explained about Mr. Woodward." Sarah's mouth tightened. Thomas Woodward always did have more charm than sense, or decency, it seems. She gestured toward the back of the house. "Come eat something first. Hard truths are better faced on a full stomach." The kitchen was warm and inviting, with a large cookstove and a wooden table that could seat at least 8. Only one other person was present, an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Peterson, a permanent resident. He tactfully focused on his meal after brief pleasantries, allowing Francis some privacy in her distress. The stew was hearty and delicious, though Francis could barely taste it. Her mind raced with increasingly desperate calculations. Her savings would last perhaps 2 weeks at modest rates. "Then what? You mentioned you were a schoolteacher," Sarah asked, interrupting Francis's spiraling thoughts. Francis looked up in surprise. "Yes, in Boston for 3 years. How did you know?" Sarah smiled. "Jack mentioned it while bringing in your trunk. He notices things." She refilled Frances's water glass. "Our school teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, is expecting her third child and plans to resign at term's end. The town council's been seeking a replacement." Hope flickered faintly in Frances's chest. "When does the term end?" "3 weeks from Friday," Sarah replied. "I serve on the school board. I could arrange an introduction." For the first time since arriving at the empty station, Frances felt something other than despair. "I would be most grateful." After dinner, Sarah showed Frances to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Rest well," she said, lingering at the doorway. "And Miss Kincaid, Hope's Point isn't Boston, but it's a good town with good people. My brother among them." Frances unpacked her nightclothes with trembling hands once alone. She had envisioned this night so differently, meeting Thomas, perhaps being introduced to his home, beginning her new life as a rancher's wife. Instead, she found herself alone in a boarding house, betrayed by a man she'd never even met. As she prepared for bed, her gaze fell upon the stack of letters tied with ribbon. Thomas's letters, filled with descriptions of his ranch, his plans for their future, his growing affection. All lies, it seemed. Frances untied the ribbon and fed the letters one by one into the small stove that heated her room, watching as Thomas Woodward's false promises curled and blackened in the flames. Morning brought sunshine streaming through lace curtains and the distant sounds of a town coming to life. Frances dressed in her second-best dress, a practical blue cotton, and pinned her light brown hair into a simple but tidy arrangement. Looking in the mirror, she smoothed her features into a mask of composure. She would not allow self-pity to consume her. Downstairs, she found the dining room occupied by several boarders enjoying Sarah's breakfast. Jack was not among them. Sarah introduced her to the other residents, 2 older ladies who taught piano and sewing, a young bank clerk, and a traveling salesman passing through. "Jack's already gone to his work," Sarah explained as she poured coffee. "He keeps cattle on a small spread north of town and helps with larger outfits when they need hands. He was very kind to assist me yesterday," Frances said. A smile touched Sarah's lips. "Kind isn't usually the first word people use for my brother. Stubborn, maybe. Reliable, certainly." After breakfast, Frances approached Sarah about employment possibilities. "While I hope for the teaching position, I'll need something in the meantime." Sarah considered this. "Normally I'd suggest the general store, but with the cattle sale, Mrs. Hammond at the hotel restaurant is short-handed. It's respectable work, serving meals." By mid-morning, Frances had secured temporary employment at the Hope's Point Hotel restaurant. Mrs. Hammond, a brisk, efficient widow in her 50s, had agreed to a 2-week trial with Frances to begin the following day. "I don't normally take on unmarried women," Mrs. Hammond had said frankly. "But Sarah Vance vouched for you, and that counts for something in this town." Frances spent the afternoon exploring Hope's Point, familiarizing herself with its layout. The town was larger than she'd initially thought, centered around Main Street, but extending several blocks in each direction. Beyond the expected businesses, general store, blacksmith, livery stable, she found a small lending library, a dressmaker, and a surprisingly well-stocked apothecary. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple white building with a bell tower. Frances lingered outside, peering through windows at the rows of desks. Teaching had been her passion in Boston. Perhaps it could be her salvation here. Returning to the boarding house for the evening meal, Frances was surprised to find Jack at the dining table. He'd cleaned up, his dark hair still damp, wearing a fresh shirt. He stood when she entered, nodding a greeting. "Miss Kincaid." "Mr. Vance, thank you again for your assistance yesterday." Jack seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Sarah says you found work at the hotel restaurant." "Yes, beginning tomorrow. and she's kindly offered to introduce me to the school board. Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. Good. Throughout dinner, Francis observed Jack's interactions with the other boarders. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. There was an understated authority in his manner, a quiet confidence she found intriguing. Later, as Francis helped Sarah clear the table, she asked about the Vance siblings' history in Hope's Point. "Our father brought us west after the war," Sarah explained, stacking plates. "Started with nothing but determination and a few head of cattle, built it into something respectable before his passing 5 years ago." She glanced toward the parlor where Jack sat reading a newspaper. "Jack took over the ranch, but I preferred town life. Started this place with my portion of the inheritance." "You've built a lovely home," Francis said sincerely. Sarah smiled. "It suits me. Jack, though he needs open spaces, always has." The next morning began Francis's new routine. She rose early, broke fast with the other boarders, then walked to the hotel restaurant to begin her shift. The work was exhausting but straightforward, serving meals, clearing tables, occasionally helping in the kitchen. The cattle buyers provided a steady stream of customers, most treating her with indifference or basic courtesy. A few made inappropriate comments or let their eyes linger too long, but Mrs. Hammond proved fiercely protective of her staff, banishing one particularly persistent cattle buyer with threats of telling his business associates about his behavior. Francis saw Jack occasionally during that first week, usually at dinner. Their interactions remained polite but limited. Yet she often felt his gaze on her when he thought she wouldn't notice, watchful, assessing, perhaps even concerned. On her 5th day in Hope's Point, Francis was clearing a table when a boisterous group of cattlemen entered the restaurant. Among them was a tall, handsome man with carefully groomed blonde hair and an expensive coat despite the warm weather. "Told Woodward he was a fool to wager his ranch on that hand," the blonde man was saying loudly. "But some men just can't help themselves." Francis froze at the name, her hands tightening on the dishes she was stacking. "Speaking of fools," another man in the group said, "heard Woodward had a mail-order bride coming. Wonder what happened to her when she found no groom and no ranch," the blonde man laughed. "Probably on the first train back east, or finding alternative arrangements. You know how these desperate spinsters are." Francis felt heat rise to her face. The stack of plates in her hands trembled slightly. Drawing a deep breath, she continued her work, keeping her back to the men. "Miss." The blonde man had noticed her. "When you're done there, we'd appreciate some service." Francis turned slowly, professional smile fixed in place. "Of course, sir. I'll be right with you." Recognition dawned on the blonde man's face, followed by a smirk. "Well now, you must be Woodward's intended. Heard you were stuck in town." The other men at the table turned to look at her with open curiosity. Francis felt her cheeks burn hotter, humiliation washing over her. "Your order, gentlemen?" she asked, ignoring the comment. "Now don't be like that," the blonde man continued. "Name's Clayton Hughes. I actually did your pretty self a favor by winning that ranch. Woodward would have drunk it away within the year anyway." Francis maintained her stiff smile. "What can I bring you to eat?" Hughes leaned forward. "How about some company instead?" "I've got a much nicer place than Woodward ever." "The lady asked for your order," came a familiar deep voice from behind Francis. Jack stood in the restaurant doorway, his posture relaxed, but something dangerous in his stance. His eyes were fixed on Hughes with unmistakable warning. Hughes's smile faltered. "Just having some friendly conversation, Vance." "Doesn't sound friendly to me." Jack stepped further into the room. "Sounds like you're harassing Mrs. Hammond's employee." A tense silence fell over the restaurant. Francis was acutely aware of every eye on them, of her own rapid heartbeat, of Jack's steady presence behind her. Hughes finally broke the standoff with an artificial laugh. "No harm intended. We'll take 5 steak dinners, miss, and coffee all around." Frances nodded and escaped to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she gave the order to the cook. When she emerged minutes later with coffee, Jack had taken a seat at a table near the door, his position giving him clear view of Hughes's group. He remained there throughout their meal, nursing a single cup of coffee. His presence ensured that Hughes and his companions ate quickly and left without further incident, though Hughes cast a resentful glance at Jack as they departed. As Frances cleared their table, Jack approached her. "You all right?" "Yes, thank you." She kept her eyes on her task. "Hughes likes to throw his weight around. His father owns half the cattle between here and Denver." Frances nodded. "He mentioned winning Mr. Woodward's ranch poker game in Denver." Woodward was 3 sheets to the wind, betting with money he didn't have. Jack hesitated. "You should know Woodward had a reputation. Women in several towns, debts everywhere. You're better off." Frances finally looked up at him. Better off stranded in a strange town with no prospects. Something shifted in Jack's expression. Determination, perhaps. "You have prospects. You're smart, capable. Sarah says you're good with figures and well-educated." Surprised by his assessment, Frances felt a strange flutter in her chest. "That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness. It's fact." Jack placed his hat on his head. "Hughes won't bother you again. If he does, you tell me." With that, he departed, leaving Frances to wonder at the protective instinct of a man who barely knew her. That evening at the boarding house, Frances found a small package outside her door, a simple whistle on a leather cord. A note in rough handwriting read, "Keep this with you. Sharp blast brings help if needed. J.V." The gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. After a lifetime of self-reliance, the simple act of someone looking out for her welfare felt foreign and precious. The next day, Sarah arranged for Frances to meet with the school board after her shift at the restaurant. The meeting took place in the town council room above the bank, a plain space with a large table where 5 board members waited to interview her. Frances presented her credentials, answered questions about her teaching philosophy, and even demonstrated a brief lesson. Throughout, she felt confident and purposeful for the first time since arriving in Hope's Point. "Your references from Boston are quite impressive," said Mr. Harrison, the board chairman, "though teaching here will be different. You'll have students of all ages in one room, some who can only attend seasonally due to ranch work." Frances nodded. "I understand the challenges, sir. I believe education must adapt to the community it serves while maintaining high standards." The board seemed pleased with her responses. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Harrison informed her they would make their decision within the week. Sarah, who had observed the proceedings, walked with Frances back to the boarding house. "You did well. I've never seen old Judge Wilkins so attentive during a candidate presentation." "I hope it's enough," Frances replied. "Mrs. Hammond's work is honest but not what I'm trained for." As they approached the boarding house, they spotted Jack on the porch, deep in conversation with another man. The stranger was well-dressed with an air of authority. "Sheriff Daniels," Sarah explained quietly. "Wonder what brings him by." The men looked up as they approached. Jack's expression was grim, the sheriff's carefully neutral. "Miss Kincaid," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "I've been hearing about you. Sorry for your situation." "Thank you, Sheriff." Frances glanced between the men, sensing tension. "Is something wrong?" Jack and the sheriff exchanged looks before the sheriff replied. "We've had a telegram from Boston. Someone's looking for you. Man named Edward Kincaid, claims to be your brother." Frances felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. My brother died at Gettysburg. 4 pairs of eyes fixed on her with varying degrees of concern and surprise. Jack stepped closer, his voice low. "You're certain?" "Of course I'm certain," Frances said, her voice strained. "We received official notification. His commanding officer wrote personally of Edward's bravery." The sheriff removed a telegram from his pocket. This came addressed to the town, asking if a Francis Kincaid had arrived on last week's train. "Says he's been trying to locate you." Gives a Boston address for reply. Frances took the paper with trembling hands, reading the brief message. The sender claimed to be Edward Kincaid, recently recovered from amnesia following war injuries, seeking his sister who he'd learned had traveled west to marry. "It's impossible," she whispered, though a treacherous hope bloomed in her chest. "Or someone's cruel joke. Or someone using your brother's name for other purposes," Jack said, his tone hardened. "Someone who knows you're here alone." Sheriff Daniels nodded. "That's my concern. Especially with you being stranded by Woodward's disappearance, makes you vulnerable." Frances straightened her shoulders, pushing aside her confusion. "What should we do?" "I've sent a reply asking for proof of identity and more details," the sheriff said. "In the meantime, best stay alert, Mrs. Vance. I trust Miss Kincaid is secure here." "Absolutely," Sarah affirmed. "And Jack checks on the house regularly." After the sheriff departed, Frances sat in the parlor, the telegram still clutched in her hand. Edward alive. It seemed beyond possibility. Yet the war had created many such stories: men lost, imprisoned, wounded beyond recognition, memories shattered. Jack remained standing, his posture tense. "Could it truly be your brother?" "I don't see how." Frances shook her head. "We buried an empty coffin, but his captain was certain." Edward was leading a charge when a shell struck nearby. They never found enough to send home. Jack's expression softened with something like recognition. War leaves ghosts behind. Sometimes they're memories. Sometimes they're men who find their way back. The quiet understanding in his voice made Frances look up sharply. "You served?" A brief nod. "Union cavalry. Last 2 years of the fighting." They fell silent, connected momentarily by the shared understanding of war's long shadow. "If it is your brother," Jack finally said, "that's a blessing beyond measure. If not—" His eyes hardened. "We'll handle it." Frances was struck by his use of "we," as if her problems had somehow become his concern, her safety his responsibility. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've done since I arrived." Jack seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just doing what needs doing." He moved toward the door. "I'll be staying in town tonight. Got business early tomorrow." After he left, Sarah joined Frances in the parlor. "My brother doesn't trust coincidences," she explained. "Man claiming to be your dead brother showing up right after you've been stranded here makes him suspicious." "You think he's staying in town to watch over the boarding house?" Frances realized. Sarah smiled. "Jack's protective of what he considers his responsibility." She patted Frances's hand. "Rest now. Tomorrow brings what it brings." That night, Frances dreamt of Edward not as she last saw him in his new uniform, proud and determined, but as he might be now, face scarred, eyes haunted by all he'd witnessed. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a desperate, irrational hope in her heart. The following days passed in anxious waiting. Frances threw herself into her work at the restaurant, grateful for the distraction. The cattle sale concluded, bringing a welcome reduction in customers and unwanted attention. Mrs. Hammond, who had heard about the telegram through town gossip, allowed Frances to finish earlier each day, understanding her need to be safely at the boarding house before dark. Jack maintained a more visible presence in town, often appearing at the restaurant near the end of Frances's shift to walk her back to his sister's house. Their walks became a quiet ritual, gradually extending as they took more circuitous routes through town. Frances found herself looking forward to these moments, Jack's solid presence beside her, his occasional observations about the town and its inhabitants, the surprising flashes of dry humor beneath his serious exterior. "Why did you help me that first day?" she asked him during one such walk, a week after her arrival. "You could have left me at the station." Jack was quiet for several steps before answering. "Couldn't leave a woman stranded, not with night coming on in the town full of drovers. Many would have. Or directed me to the hotel and considered their duty done." He glanced at her, then back to the street ahead. "My father taught us better than that." "You miss him," Frances observed. "Sarah speaks of him often. Good man, hard but fair." Jack adjusted his hat. "Taught us to measure ourselves by how we treat those who need help, not by what we accumulate." "A wise philosophy," Frances smiled. "He would be proud of you both, I think." Jack's expression softened momentarily. "Maybe, still trying to live up to him." 4 days after the telegram arrived, Sheriff Daniels appeared at the restaurant near closing time, his expression serious. Jack, who had just arrived to escort Frances, tensed visibly at the sheriff's approach. "Received a response," Sheriff Daniels said without preamble. "Man claiming to be Edward Kincaid has provided details: your parents' names, childhood home address, name of your family dog." Frances felt her knees weaken. Those things could be discovered by someone determined enough. "True," the sheriff acknowledged, "but there's more. Says he carries a pocket watch with an inscription from your father: time passes, love endures." Frances gasped softly. The watch had been a gift on Edward's 18th birthday, the inscription a private family sentiment. "That's correct. He's traveling here," the sheriff continued. "Says he'll arrive on Friday's train with proof of his identity and explanation of his circumstances." Friday. Just 3 days away. Frances looked to Jack, finding his expression carefully neutral but his eyes intense. "We'll meet this train," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "See who this man really is." That evening at the boarding house, Frances searched through her trunk until she found a small daguerreotype, the last image taken of Edward before he departed for war. A handsome young man of 20, with her same light brown hair and serious eyes, dressed in his new uniform. She showed it to Jack and Sarah in the parlor after dinner. "This is Edward. If this man is truly my brother, I'll know immediately." Jack studied the image carefully. "I'll recognize him too, then." The following day brought a welcome distraction. Mr. Harrison from the school board visited the restaurant to inform Frances that she had been selected as Hope's Point's new teacher, to begin after Mrs. Abernathy's departure in 2 weeks. "The board was most impressed with your credentials and presentation," he told her, beaming. "Mrs. Abernathy has agreed to introduce you to the students and show you her methods before departing." Frances felt a wave of relief and genuine happiness. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I promise to serve the children of Hope's Point with my very best efforts." The news spread quickly through the small town. By evening, several parents had stopped her on the street to introduce themselves and welcome her as the new teacher. The genuine warmth of their reception touched Frances deeply. When she shared the news with Jack during their evening walk, his response was a simple nod and "never doubted they'd choose you." Coming from a man of few words, Frances recognized the compliment for what it was. "That means a great deal coming from you." Jack glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Why's that?" "Because you don't offer praise lightly," she said. "I've noticed that about you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Been watching me, have you?" The teasing question brought color to Frances's cheeks. "One observes those around them. It's only natural." "Natural," he repeated, his voice warming slightly. "What else have you observed, Miss Kincaid?" Frances felt a fluttering in her chest at his unexpected playfulness. "That you prefer coffee black, but add cream when you think no one's looking. That you always enter a room and immediately locate all exits. That you're gentler with Sarah than anyone else, but she's the only person who can make you truly laugh." Jack stopped walking, genuine surprise on his face. "You've been paying closer attention than I realized." Frances suddenly felt self-conscious about her admissions. "As I said, one observes." They resumed walking, a new awareness between them. After several moments, Jack spoke again. "Your teaching position, it means you'll be staying in Hope's Point." "Yes," Frances confirmed. "If the man claiming to be Edward truly is my brother, I'll help him settle somewhere nearby. If not—" She squared her shoulders. "I have employment, lodging, and am beginning to make acquaintances." "It's more than many have." Jack nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. When they reached the boarding house, he hesitated before leaving. "About Friday. No matter who steps off that train, brother, imposter, or no one at all, nothing changes about your place here. Remember that." His words warmed her more than they should have. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." "Jack," he corrected quietly. "After all this, might as well use my given name." "Jack," she repeated, testing the informality. "Then I'm Frances to you." He nodded once, a small smile touching his lips. "Frances. Sleep well." Friday dawned clear and warm. Frances dressed with particular care in her best dress, a deep green that brought out the golden flecks in her brown eyes. She arranged her hair in a style Edward would recognize and pinned their mother's cameo at her throat. Jack arrived at the boarding house mid-morning, dressed in a clean shirt and his least worn denim, his dark hair freshly trimmed. Sheriff Daniels would meet them at the station, he explained, to ensure everything remained orderly regardless of who arrived. The wait at the station was excruciating. Frances paced the platform while Jack stood sentinel-like, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The sheriff arrived shortly before the train was due, nodding to them both. "Whatever happens," he told Frances kindly, "we'll handle it proper." When the train finally appeared in the distance, belching smoke against the blue sky, Frances felt her heart might pound out of her chest. Jack moved closer to her side, his steady presence anchoring her. The train pulled into the station with a screech of metal and a great burst of steam. Passengers began to disembark, a family with children, 2 businessmen, an elderly couple. Frances searched each face with increasing desperation. Then, descending from the second passenger car, came a man who made her breath catch. Tall and thin, much thinner than the boy who'd gone to war. Light brown hair like her own, though liberally streaked with premature gray. A terrible scar running from his left temple down his cheek, but the eyes that found hers across the platform were unmistakable. "Edward," she whispered, too softly for anyone to hear. The man stopped, staring at her with equal intensity, his face transformed with emotion. "Franny," he called, using the childhood nickname only her brother had ever used. Frances didn't remember moving. Suddenly she was running, propriety forgotten, and then Edward's arms were around her, real, solid, alive. She sobbed against his chest while he murmured reassurances, his own voice breaking with emotion. "They told us you were dead," she finally managed, pulling back to search his face. "We had a funeral." Edward's scarred face twisted with regret. "I nearly was. Head wound at Gettysburg. Couldn't remember my name for almost a year. By the time I recovered enough, the war was over, the regiment disbanded." He touched his scar self-consciously. "Spent years piecing my memory back together. When I finally returned to Boston, our parents were gone, and neighbors said you'd traveled west to marry." Frances was vaguely aware of Jack and the sheriff approaching, maintaining a respectful distance while remaining watchful. How did you find me?" She asked. "Traced you through the mail service in Boston, found your correspondence with Woodward." Edward's expression hardened. "Learned about his reputation too late to warn you. I've been chasing your trail since, terrified of what might have happened." Jack stepped forward then, his posture cautious but less tense. "Mr. Kincaid, Jackson Vance." Edward assessed Jack with a brother's protective instinct. "You've been looking after my sister and I both," Jack confirmed. "Francis has secured employment here, teaching position." Pride shone in Edward's eyes as he looked back at Francis. "Always said you'd make a fine teacher." Sheriff Daniels approached then, introducing himself with professional courtesy. "Understand you have documentation, Mr. Kincaid." Edward nodded, reaching into his coat to produce several papers, military discharge documents, a physician's statement regarding his injuries and memory loss, and the pocket watch Francis had mentioned. The sheriff examined them briefly before nodding his satisfaction. "Seems in order." "Welcome to Hope's Point, Mr. Kincaid." As they left the station, Edward carrying his single travel bag, Francis found herself walking between her brother and Jack, the past she'd thought lost forever, and the man who'd become her unexpected protector. "I've taken a room at the boarding house," she explained to Edward. "Sarah Vance, Jack's sister, runs it. There's likely space for you as well." Edward glanced between Francis and Jack with shrewd assessment. "I won't be imposing long, just need to catch my breath, make arrangements." "No rush," Jack said, meeting Edward's gaze with quiet understanding. "Your sister's made a place for herself here. You're welcome to do the same." The days that followed were a blur of joy and adjustment for Francis. Having Edward back felt miraculous, yet they were both changed by the years and experiences that had separated them. Her brother was quieter now, troubled by occasional headaches and nightmares, legacies of his wound. Yet his essential nature remained intelligent, principled, with the dry wit she remembered. Edward settled temporarily at the boarding house, taking meals with the other residents and spending long hours in conversation with Francis as they rebuilt their connection. He showed particular interest in her developing friendship with Jack, observing their interactions with thoughtful attention. "Vance seems a good man," Edward commented one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. "Not one for many words, but his actions speak clearly." Francis felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "He's been very kind." Edward smiled knowingly. "More than kind, I think. The way he watches you when you're not looking, that's not just kindness." "Edward, please," Francis protested, though her heart quickened at his suggestion. "You watch him too," Edward continued, undeterred. "Reminds me of how our parents were together, that awareness of each other, even across a room." Francis changed the subject, uncomfortable with her brother's observations, yet unable to deny them completely to herself. Jack had become important to her in ways that went beyond gratitude or friendship: his steady presence, his quiet strength, the rare smiles that transformed his serious face. As Francis prepared to assume her teaching duties, Jack helped Edward secure work at the livery stable. Edward's way with horses, a skill from his cavalry days, quickly impressed the owner, leading to discussions of potential partnership. Hope's Point was growing, the livery owner explained, and he wasn't getting any younger. 2 weeks after Edward's arrival, Francis officially began teaching at the Hope's Point school. Mrs. Abernathy had introduced her to the students' 28 children ranging from 6 to 16 years before departing for her confinement. Francis threw herself into the role with enthusiasm, quickly establishing routines and earning the children's respect. The challenges were different from Boston students with widely varying educational backgrounds, some attending irregularly due to ranch responsibilities, but she adapted her methods creatively. Jack appeared at the schoolhouse one afternoon as the children were being dismissed, leaning against the doorframe with casual ease. "Teacher Kincaid," he greeted her, his eyes warm with something that made her pulse quicken. "Mr. Vance," she returned, organizing papers on her desk. "What brings you to my classroom? Thought you might like to see something, if you have time." Intrigued, Frances gathered her shawl. "My time is my own until dinner." Jack led her to his horse, helping her mount before climbing up behind her. This time, there was no trunk between them, and Frances was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, his arms reaching around her to hold the reins. They rode north of town, following a creek that wound through stands of cottonwood trees. After about 20 minutes, they crested a small rise, and Jack reined the horse to a stop. Below them stretched a modest ranch, a sturdy cabin, corral, barn, and grazing land extending toward distant hills. A small herd of cattle dotted the landscape, with a few horses in the nearer pasture. "Your ranch?" Frances asked, taking in the scene. "My father's legacy. Built it from nothing." Pride colored Jack's voice. "Not the biggest spread, but good land. Creek never runs dry, even in drought years." "It's beautiful," Frances said sincerely. "Why haven't you mentioned it before?" Jack was quiet a moment, his breath warm against her hair. "Wasn't relevant at first, then. Wanted you to know me before you knew what I had." The implication of his words sent a flutter through Frances's chest. "Why show me now? Your brother's settling here." "You're teaching the town's children." Jack's voice lowered. "Thought you should see all your options in Hope's Point." Frances turned slightly in the saddle, trying to see his expression. "Options?" Jack met her gaze, his blue eyes more open than she'd ever seen them. "Been thinking about your arrival, how things might have been different if Woodward had met that train." "If he had," Frances said softly, "I would never have met you." Something in Jack's face softened. "No, and I find I'm grateful for his absence, though it caused you pain." The admission hung between them, significant and weighty. Frances felt her heart racing, aware of how improper their position was alone, so close on horseback yet unable to regret it. "I'm grateful too," she finally whispered. "Though perhaps we shouldn't say such things yet." Jack nodded, understanding her caution. He turned the horse back toward town, but before urging it forward, he spoke again. "Not rushing you, Frances. Just wanted you to know when you're ready to consider a future here. There's more waiting than just the schoolhouse." The ride back was quiet, both lost in thought about what had been said and what remained unspoken. When they reached town, Edward was waiting on the boarding house porch, his expression a mixture of concern and knowing amusement. "Took my sister sightseeing, Vance?" he asked as Jack helped Frances dismount. "Showed her my ranch," Jack replied, unembarrassed. "Thought she should see it." Edward's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did you now? Interesting timing." Frances gave her brother a quelling look. Jack was being neighborly. "Of course," Edward agreed, not bothering to hide his smile. "Very neighborly to show a lady your property, particularly when she's unattached and you're unmarried." Frances felt her cheeks flame, but Jack merely met Edward's gaze steadily. "Don't believe I was hiding my intentions, Kincaid." "Didn't think you were, Vance." Edward's smile softened. "Just making sure we understand each other." "I believe we do," Jack replied, and some silent male communication seemed to pass between them. Frances cleared her throat. "I'm standing right here, gentlemen." Both men had the grace to look slightly abashed. Jack tipped his hat to her. "Sunday dinner. Both of you at the ranch. Sarah's coming too." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Frances to face her brother's knowing expression. "Not a word," she warned Edward as they entered the boarding house. Edward raised his hands in surrender, but his eyes danced with amusement. "Wouldn't dream of it, Franny." Sunday dinner at Jack's ranch became a new tradition over the following weeks. The first visit had been somewhat formal, with Sarah accompanying them and Edward maintaining a protective brotherly presence. But as autumn progressed and the aspen leaves turned golden on the hillsides, these gatherings relaxed into comfortable familiarity. Francis was surprised to discover Jack was an excellent cook, a skill he'd developed by necessity after his father's death. His home was simple but well-maintained, with a few unexpected touches that spoke of refinement, books lining shelves, his mother's china carefully preserved, a piano that Sarah sometimes played after dinner. Edward, meanwhile, had committed fully to Hope's Point, investing his modest savings in partnership at the livery stable. He'd found lodging in rooms above the business, giving Francis both independence and the comfort of having family nearby. As October brought cooler weather, Francis found herself thinking more about Jack's unspoken offer. Teaching fulfilled her professionally, and she had developed genuine friendships in town, particularly with Sarah and Mrs. Hammond. Yet she increasingly looked forward to moments alone with Jack, brief walks after church, occasional rides to his ranch, quiet conversations on the boarding house porch. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Jack invited Francis to ride with him to check fence lines on his property. Edward, now comfortable with their relationship, merely smiled knowingly as Jack helped Francis onto his horse. The day was perfect, clear blue skies, golden leaves, the mountains in the distance already showing snow on their peaks. They rode in comfortable silence, Jack occasionally pointing out features of his land or sharing stories of his father's early days establishing the ranch. Near a stand of aspen trees, they dismounted to let the horse rest. Jack spread his coat on a fallen log for Francis to sit. "Winter comes early at this elevation," he commented, looking toward the mountains. "Another month we'll have snow here too." "I've never experienced a mountain winter," Francis admitted. "Edward says they can be quite severe." Jack nodded. "They can, but there's beauty in it too. The way snow blankets everything, the silence after a storm." Francis studied his profile, struck by the poetic quality of his observation. "You love this land very much." "It's part of me." Jack turned to face her. "My father used to say a man puts his heart into the land he works. Becomes connected to it." "A lovely sentiment." Francis smiled. "And very true, I think. I feel something similar about teaching. That part of my heart goes into each child's education." Jack moved to sit beside her on the log, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Been thinking about that, your teaching and my ranching." Francis's pulse quickened. "Have you? They don't have to be separate things." Jack's voice was quiet but clear. "The ranch is close enough to town. You could continue teaching if you wanted." Understanding dawned on Francis. "If I wanted?" Jack turned to face her directly, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "Francis, I'm not good with fancy words, but I think you know what I'm trying to say." "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I'd like to hear it plainly all the same." Taking a deep breath, Jack took her gloved hand in his. "When you stepped off that train, you were looking for someone else, but I found myself thinking right from that first day that Woodward's loss might be my gain." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm asking if you might consider a future here, with me, as my wife." Though she had anticipated the direction of their conversation, the actual proposal still took her breath away. Francis looked into his earnest blue eyes, seeing the man who had come to her rescue that first day, who had protected her, supported her, and gradually stolen her heart. "Your sister once told me you notice things," Francis said, her voice trembling slightly. "Have you noticed how I've come to feel about you?" A smile warmed Jack's eyes. "Hoped maybe, not certain." Then let me be certain, Frances whispered. Yes, Jack, I would be honored to be your wife. The joy that transformed his usually serious face was something Frances knew she would remember always. Jack raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with reverent tenderness. May I? He asked, his eyes never leaving hers as he leaned slightly closer. Frances nodded, her heart pounding as Jack's hand gently cupped her cheek. His kiss was gentle and unhurried, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, the wonder in his expression matched the feeling expanding in her own chest. I never expected this, she admitted. When Thomas Woodward failed to meet that train, I thought my future had collapsed. Jack tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch achingly tender. Sometimes life has better plans than the ones we make. Much better, Frances agreed, leaning forward to initiate another kiss. They returned to town as the afternoon light waned, both aware their changed relationship would soon be evident to all who saw them. Edward was waiting on the boarding house porch, one look at their expressions telling him everything he needed to know. About time, he said, rising to shake Jack's hand. Thought you might need another month of fence-checking excuses. Frances blushed deeply. You knew. Everyone knew, Edward laughed. Mrs. Hammond's been planning what to serve at your wedding breakfast for weeks. Word spread quickly through Hope's Point. By Sunday church service, Frances found herself receiving congratulations from townsfolk she barely knew, all seeming genuinely pleased by the match. Sarah hugged her with tears in her eyes, whispering, "You've brought something back to him I feared was lost forever." They were married 4 weeks later in the small church, with Edward giving the bride away and Sarah standing as witness. Frances wore a new dress of deep blue silk, a gift from Jack that matched his eyes, with her mother's cameo at her throat and wild asters in her hair. The entire town attended both ceremony and celebration afterward. Even Clayton Hughes made an appearance, surprisingly gracious as he offered congratulations and a fine set of silver as a wedding gift. Woodward did you both a favor by being a no-good scoundrel, Hughes told them with unexpected sincerity. Some things work out as they should. As the winter sun set early on their wedding day, Jack brought his bride home to the ranch that would now be theirs together. He'd made improvements in recent weeks. New curtains Sarah had helped him select, a larger bed, shelves for Frances's books. Standing in the doorway, Jack surprised Frances by sweeping her into his arms. Tradition, he explained with a smile, carrying her across the threshold. That night, as snow began to fall outside their window, Frances discovered yet another side to the quiet, serious man she'd married, a tenderness and passion that left her breathless, wondering how she could ever have imagined a life with anyone else. I keep thinking about that day at the station, she whispered later, nestled against his chest. If you hadn't come along. Jack's arms tightened around her. But I did, and now you're here, where you belong. Spring came to Hope's Point with its usual drama of late snows and sudden thaws, wildflowers appearing overnight in meadows still patched with white. Frances continued teaching, riding to town each morning and back to the ranch each afternoon, finding joy in balancing her professional calling with her new life as Jack's wife. Edward thrived as well, his partnership in the livery stable proving profitable as the town continued to grow. He began courting the widow who ran the dressmaker's shop, his easy charm and kindness gradually winning her trust after a difficult first marriage. One warm May evening, as Frances and Jack sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains, she shared the news she'd been certain of for a week, but had waited to confirm. "We'll need to prepare a nursery," she said quietly, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat abdomen. "By winter." Jack's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "A baby, you're certain?" Frances nodded, her eyes shining. "Dr. Martin confirmed it today. Our child will arrive around Christmas, he believes." Jack gathered her into his arms, his joy too great for words. Later, he would tell her of his plans to build a cradle like the one his father had made for him, of his hopes for teaching their child to ride and appreciate the land. But in that moment, he simply held her, overwhelmed by how completely his life had changed since that fateful day at the train station. "Her groom never showed at the station," Jack murmured against her hair, "but I'm here now. Always. And I thank Providence for that every day," Frances whispered back, knowing that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disappointments, and that love finds its way through the most unexpected circumstances. Their son, James Edward Vance, arrived during the first heavy snowfall of December, strong, lunged, and determined like his father, with his mother's thoughtful eyes. By the time he was 2, he had a sister, Sarah Louise, named for her aunt, who had played such an important role in bringing their parents together. Hope's Point continued to grow, eventually requiring a larger school building and a second teacher. Frances maintained her position until their third child was expected, then trained her replacement while focusing on educating her own children until they were old enough for formal schooling. Edward and his wife purchased the general store when the previous owner retired, expanding its offerings to serve the growing community. Their regular family dinners now required 2 tables pushed together, filled with laughter, stories, and the next generation of Vances and Kincaids. On their 10th anniversary, Jack surprised Frances with a journey east to visit her old home in Boston, traveling by the same train route that had brought her to Hope's Point. Standing on the platform where they had first met, they found themselves remembering that pivotal moment with wonder at how differently things might have unfolded. "I sometimes think about him, you know," Frances admitted quietly. "Thomas Woodward. Wonder what became of him." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Heard he tried his luck in California. Mining, I think." He looked down at her, his blue eyes still capable of making her heart race after a decade together. "Reckon I owe the man a debt, in a way." Frances laughed softly. "As do I, though I wouldn't have said so at the time." Jack's arm tightened around her waist. "Life has a way of working out if you're brave enough to face what comes. And if someone is there to say, 'I'm here now,' when you most need to hear it," Frances added, rising on tiptoes to kiss the man who had transformed her greatest disappointment into her greatest blessing.